All right, everyone. Good afternoon. I know there's still going to be people joining us, but I want to be mindful of the time, especially being an later afternoon event. Thank you for joining us today. We're here for the presentation, Innovative Engagement Strategies for Community Supported Planning. At least I hope that's why you're here. Feel free, if you don't mind, popping into the chat your name and organization and even the city you're from, so we can kind of get an idea of who's in the room and what communities you maybe where you live or where you might represent, your work. That's really helpful for us. And even if you want to, if there's something you're hoping to hear about today, feel free to throw that into the chat. It kind of helps us just as we're getting our program moving along. The event is being recorded, so shortly after we will be sharing with everyone who attended, and sometime within this month, we'll also make sure it gets up onto our online library. We try to make sure all of our webinar type of things are available there for our members and the wider community. I want to start by thanking our sponsors. Our sponsors help us throughout the year, but also, for this event specifically, being able to provide it free of charge. So thank you to the AIA New Hampshire, the New Hampshire Planners Association, and then the folks over at Make Architects, Chris Kennedy and Sloan Mayer and their team there in Hanover. We really appreciate the support for today. This is kind of our kickoff for New Hampshire Gives, which I will say a little bit about, but I don't want to belabor it too much. But we really appreciate their support. I know many of you know who we are. I see a lot of familiar names and faces. I'm Tiffany Tononi McNamara. I'm the executive director here at Plan New Hampshire. And for those who might be new to our organization, we have basically been the go-to smart growth and livability organization in New Hampshire since 1989. Our mission is to foster excellence in planning, design, and development of New Hampshire's built environment. And so all of our work tries to support that mission. And one of the ways that we fulfill that mission is organizing events like this today, whether they're in person or virtual, so webinars and educational events and discussions. So thank you for being a part of it. In addition to myself, there's also Cecilia Azzi. She's our part-time membership coordinator. Give us a wave if anyone's looking at their gallery. Thanks, Cecilia. If you are a member, you probably at least recognize her name because a lot of our membership emails come from Cecilia, and she is a great help to me and a great resource for our organization. I do want to acknowledge our board as well, because we couldn't do this as a 1.5 person organization without such an active board. And I see several of our board members on this call. And, they're all very active in the, yay, yes, give a wave. They're very active in the field of community development, and they're our biggest cheerleaders and our strongest volunteers. So thank you to our board members. One last order of business. Oh, and thank you to our members. Sorry. We are membership based, and we couldn't do what we do without the support of our members. So I want to acknowledge all of our members. These are our platinum and gold members. So their support really helps keep us going. Many of them support us year after year. GPI, JSA, New Hampshire Saves, the Rowley Agency, Selloway and Hollis, and our gold members, Cross Insurance, Harvey Construction, the Novus Group, and VHB. So they're a very important part of our organization, and we work closely with a lot of our members, and some of you are a part of those groups. So the last order of business before I turn to see who's here in the audience is that today is New Hampshire Gives Day. It kicks off today at 5 p.m. And it's a 24-hour period of giving in the Granite State. It is something organized by the Center, New Hampshire Center for Nonprofits, and it's a really important day for all nonprofits in the state, including ourselves, and we've been a part of it for several years. If you like what you see and hear today, I hope that you might consider going to our New Hampshire Gives profile. We'll share the link later in this presentation, and possibly giving a donation and supporting our work. It's a great day for nonprofits to raise awareness about our mission and our work. And there's also some extra dollars that come from New Hampshire Gives to match the fundraising that happens on this day. And when I say this day, it's until 5 p.m. tomorrow. So in case you just have to move on at 5 today or 5:30 today, and you feel the bug tomorrow, you can always support us then. So on we go. I am going to want to find out who's in the room with us today. One, I couldn't avoid this, like using this stock photo of thumbs ups, because I don't get a lot of chance to use those types of stock photos. So thank you for experiencing it with me. But I want to ask, I'm going to do a poll here. We don't do polls too much, so hopefully, I know it's a very simple thing that people do nowadays, but let me just hope that it's going to go okay here. Basically going to ask what your profession is, or how you might identify professionally. So I'll launch the poll. You know, are you a planner, architect, landscape architect, engineer? Are you in construction? Other? If it's other, feel free to throw into the chat that you are like an awesome librarian, or whatever other type of profession you might identify with. We have a pretty huge cross section of members and folks who come to our events. So I'm not surprised that there probably will be several other. I'm going to give it one more second. And then, all right, so I see you guys can you guys see the poll results? I hope you can. Someone give me a head shake. Okay, 29% of folks today planners, 10% architects, 5% landscape architects, a few engineers, well, one, I guess, some construction folks, and then we've got other. I'm gonna have to look in the chat and see what's going on. Oh, okay, we do have an awesome librarian. I love that. Folks from housing commissions, some of our board members, the RPCs, this is great. That's great. Thank you guys for sharing that. That really helps. And I have one other question, and then you won't have to suffer through any more polls. And this is related to your experience with community engagement. So I based the question off the 5 levels, or quote unquote like stages of expertise, but I also couldn't resist this image, even though it doesn't 100% match up with the poll. Found it online, don't really know how to credit it. I'm not going to lie. I'm not sure who created it. It was not me, but hopefully this somewhat speaks to what I'm trying to get at. So the second poll. Oh, sorry guys, I didn't know I didn't share the results of that poll. There are the results. I know I said them, but I apologize about that. Okay, so the next poll, which of course is giving me a little tricky, here we go, is do you consider yourself novice, advanced beginner, competent, proficient, expert? You know, obviously this is just what you think of yourself, your experience, and I don't know, what's the difference between competent and proficient? Maybe the Jedi piece might help, but people are still responding. And I think all of us do some level of community engagement. So you're probably also underselling your experience, because we don't have one expert in the room, and I don't believe that, but here's the results. So someone who said they're novice, and then a lot of folks kind of in between, like beginner, competent, proficient. That's good to know. I shouldn't say we don't have an expert. We have Mark Evans here, so we do have an expert. That's why we're all here today. So thank you all for helping me like be able to add Zoom polls to my resume, because that is not something I do very often. So I am going to, without further ado, because I don't want to keep talking into the silence, I'm going to introduce Mark. He is our speaker today. Oh, I'm so sorry. Well, we're just going to roll with that. It was my last slide anyways, so if everyone's okay with that. So Mark Evans is a professional planner and architect. He has over 30 years experience engaging with communities and creating transformative plans for vibrant and walkable neighborhoods, villages, and downtowns. To support the implementation of these walkable towns and mixed use places. He leads teams in the preparation of downtown plans, master plans, traditional neighborhood ordinances, and form-based codes. Mark initiates community engagement strategies to bring together public planning goals and private development realities with the goal of creating places that support local commerce and are rooted in local architectural traditions. Mark is also the director of planning at Derrick & Edson, and they are a full service planning and design firm with a mission to shape the natural and built environment in innovative and functional ways. They pride themselves in their inclusive approach to planning that engages the community and its stakeholders in ways that have generated enthusiasm and a high degree of support for planning and enhancement projects for clients throughout New England and the Mid-Atlantic region. So please join me in welcoming Mark, a little like emoji hand claps or whatnot. And I'm going to turn it over to him to lead us through the rest of today's presentation.
Tiffany, thank you so much. Can everyone see my screen? Just want to make sure. Good. Okay, great. Thrilled to be here today. I really honor the work that you all are doing to forward smart growth and community planning throughout New Hampshire. I've had the privilege of working in your state a couple times and visiting for travel and fun reasons, and ride your railroads and hike your mountains and really enjoy your countryside. And I spend most of my summers in Vermont and Champlain Island, so I get over to New Hampshire from time to time during my travels. So great to connect with you all here. I'm excited to share with you a little bit about sort of things I've learned over the years in community engagement, and we'll sort of weave together themes related to how community engagement can support innovative planning, the kind of planning that I know you and your communities are really working hard to make happen across the state. So I hope I can share a few meaningful ideas, and and along the way, looking forward to dialogue. We've agreed to sort of break this into thirds in the middle of after the first and second section that I present. Looking forward to having conversations. So I know that Tiffany and Cecilia are planning on. If you have comments or questions or things that you might forget 10 minutes later, feel free to add them into the chat so that Tiffany and Cecilia can sort of offer any comments and facilitate the conversation in between each of these sessions. So I'm going to dive in, and really the topic that I'm going to focus on here is really innovative engagement strategies and really how it all ties together with progressive planning. Our firm, Derrick & Edson, is a 35-person design firm. We are involved in the planning and landscape architecture and civil engineering of communities, villages, mixed-use centers, campuses, neighborhoods. We're currently working in Nashua at Riviera University, as well as in Manchester at St. Anselm College, and we're working, all across sort of the eastern U.S. In a variety of campus planning initiatives as well as downtown planning. And so I lead, as director of planning, I lead our downtown and community planning projects. And we're primarily focused on the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast region in our work. But so that's a little bit about us, and just a few other examples of sort of the walkable neighborhoods that we focus on, really context sensitive examples of how neighborhoods can sort of be designed in context with their adjoining architecture. And then we also spend a lot of time focusing on villages and sort of mid-sized community downtowns, maybe 3, 4, 5, 10,000 people, not large cities. So so that's a little bit about us. And so what I'm gonna sort of bring to you is this notion that I really see community engagement as part of a continuum, a part where it's a part of beginning the conversation. It's really a part of starting the dialogue to make sure that whatever a community aspires to, however it wants to evolve and transform, it starts with conversations. It starts with listening. It starts with making sure that we're doing more listening and speaking, and that we're doing our best to sort of collect the best ideas from a community rather than imparting our own values on what the community may want. And so with that community engagement, we need to marry that with a compelling vision and an economic strategy for why would a community go through a process of changing, whether you're updating a road or adding trails or adding residences or upgrading your commercial district. It needs to have a vision and a clear strategy. And then the third thing I'm going to focus on is place-based design standards. Not just zoning for zoning's sake, but really focusing on how do we make sure that we take the time to listen and understand design, and making sure the design standards that get implemented as a part of a community engagement effort are meaningful and are in character with the communities that you all are a part of. And ultimately, this is what I believe will lead to vibrancy, lead to strong economies, places people care about, places people love. And so if we're not focused on that kind of balance between what people love and sort of economic strength of our communities, it's probably sort of a missed opportunity. So, so in terms of the sort of the three parts that I'm going to share with you today, I'm going to just show a few examples here. First, there are a lot of examples all around us of missed opportunities. Missed opportunities where that side yard needs some love, and through the combination of murals and placemaking and community conversations, that side yard can become a place that people want to hang out, a place where people want to be. If you've got your community has a corner lot that has way too many weeds and maybe doesn't have the kind of vibrancy or color, through community engagement, we can figure out that maybe that neighborhood really wants a community garden. Maybe there's ways to sort of reflect community pride for engaging in a mural project and making sure those sidewalks are safe and passable. Maybe your community has a bunch of streets that are overpaved and lacking in character and love and attention. And so part of what we might be envisioning together is landscaping and pedestrian ways and places where people can gather. And then here's another example of a commercial property with a loading dock and a garage and a sort of a blank side wall, but through effective visioning, we can begin to think through how could that become a plaza, a public place, a community gathering place that brings energy back to our that neighborhood. Here's an example of a municipal building. I'm sure there are a lot of examples of underutilized buildings here and there. This particular municipality said that their municipal building was no longer serving them, and they said they would rather downsize into a slightly smaller space. And they have now sold it. They have created a restaurant and a brewery in this location. And so this is an example of a rendering that inspired implementation of a restaurant and a brewery in that location. And then the final one here is an example. Most of our communities have that one building that just hasn't received that fresh coat of paint in a while and needs some love. And so through the visioning process and working together with partners and private property owners and grants and things like that, we can help figure out how can we envision a transformation of that block or that building. So these are the three kind of tiers of topics that we're going to go through today. Community engagement strategies, number one. Community supported planning, number two. And the third, we'll focus on form-based design standards. And I believe that community engagement needs to be not just about talking, but about action. Community engagement isn't an end in itself as much as it is a catalyst for meaningful and positive change. And so my challenge, and I think hopefully what I leave you with today, is the way in which community engagement is a strategic tool in your toolbox of how to kind of initiate a community supported planning process that has legitimacy and authenticity because it's connected to the residents and property owners and community leaders of a community, and how it ends in something that isn't just talk, but is meaningful action that's embedded in zoning and design standards that make sure that that talk is tied together with meaningful standards that can be implemented to make sure that the vision that everyone talked about has a reasonable chance of looking the way it was intended. So, so I'm going to sort of jump into the community engagement piece here. And the four key elements that I would ask you to think about as you look at community engagement strategies, first and foremost, is the why. There's lots of different motivations for communities to go about a community engagement process. For starters, the why can be anything from rehabilitating an underutilized building. Maybe there's a vacant or underutilized site, or maybe there's an underutilized shopping center that has an anchor that has no longer needed, or maybe it has a vacancy in a shopping center. So that's one example. Community engagement process can be involved about quality of life. Is there traffic calming or safety improvements or walkability that can improve the quality of the community? Many examples include what can we do to enhance vitality and commerce? Maybe there's a village center or a commercial center that needs some new tenants, needs a new economic purpose, and that community dialogue can really help make that happen. And then the fourth and typical one would be, how do we protect and preserve the character of what makes our community special? And so I think the emphasis on any one of these can be a good motivation. The image you see on the right here is a community near me where our team worked on preserving an old inn. This was an old inn with a restaurant on the ground floor, and then the infill singles and twins and townhomes were really sort of making sure that preserving the old and infill with appropriate scaled infill worked in that community. And then another aspect of why would be making sure that, I don't have to remind you, but our economies are changing rapidly. The nature of online retail is changing bricks and mortar retail every day. And so we need to make sure that we're having daily conversations about how we can really think about economic development and make sure that we're preparing for the next evolution of how our buildings can and should be flexible and how our zoning standards can and should be flexible to allow different forms of commerce to occur within our buildings. We also need to make sure that we're agreeing on what do we want to preserve and how do we want to grow and where do we want to grow. And so all of these conversations need dialogue, need transparency so that we can really agree on where we focus our energies and how we stay attuned to our community preferences. And then another aspect of the who is there are, these are 5 or 6 of the typical groups that we're engaging in our community engagement processes, everyone from residents, employers, business leaders, recreation advocates, transportation advocates, public works, civic organizations, school leaders. And it's fairly typical to have a series of focus groups or small conversations with small groups of those representing those organizations or those neighborhoods. But part of what we often realize is that there are a lot of underrepresented voices that don't get heard. And so we need to take the time to identify who do we really think we need to hear from? Who are we missing out on? Have we heard from the 17-year-olds and the 24-year-olds? Have we heard from the 80-year-olds? Have we heard from the people who are working 2 jobs who are struggling to just make ends meet, and that another community meeting is just one extra task that makes it difficult? And then those who don't have internet access. And also, so I think making sure that we have an intentional plan. Many of us put together a plan for what we want to do when we want to work on a project. We should be just as intentional with a community engagement plan to make sure that it has clear goals as to who we're reaching out to and how we're going to connect with them. There certainly will be examples of where there are underrepresented voices, and there are different strategies for how to connect with those folks. One is to staff a booth at a community event. If you're trying to reach somebody and you've got a couple ideas of what could happen on that vacant lot or on that sidewalk or on that underutilized corner of a municipal facility, get a tent, get a couple display boards, and make sure that there's a community event happening there so that it's there's a dialogue that can happen. Bring the conversation to the people. Visit schools and engage with students. Sometimes they can be highly influential in bringing back ideas back to their parents to say, hey, I just heard that there's an idea for a new skate park or a new trail or a new event. Mom and dad, how can we learn more about this? I'd love to learn more. Our churches and faith-based organizations are another place where we can bring lots of ideas to the table. Posting flyers in libraries and workplaces. And I think we need to also, when we're looking at internet and smartphones, sometimes doing a survey is a great idea, but sometimes those surveys are not as compatible with smartphones as they could be. So make sure that that survey is smartphone compatible. If you're working in a multilingual community or know there's a reasonable set of additional languages, figure out how to make it multilingual. And there are a number of software tools that help make surveys multilingual. And finally, make it short and sweet. If your survey or your engagement is more than 5 minutes, you've probably lost your audience if you're trying to get those tough to reach individuals. So keep it short and sweet. And then I was going to talk about how. So once you've figured out who your target audience is, start small. Start the conversations in 5, 10, maybe a dozen people at those initial meetings, to make sure that we all understand who are those that we need to hear from, and make sure that we do a good deal of listening. As the group size gets bigger and bigger, it's harder and harder to hear the nuances of why that's a good idea. Maybe you might learn along the way that something was done 2 or 3 or 5 years ago that failed for reasons that you never understood, and maybe you can learn what didn't work previously before you move forward. And so what we typically recommend is that you begin with these kind of one-on-one interviews. And that could be a neighborhood leader, it could be a community leader, it could be making sure that you've got at least 6 or 7 or 8 individuals from diverse perspectives before you assume that you have the full picture. From that point, you can then use those individuals to help say, hey, how would we reach this community of residents? How would we reach this community of property owners or business leaders or school advocates? Making sure that we have those small conversations, then leading to a design workshop, whether it be a charrette or an open house or a community meeting or a town hall meeting. That's typically the way that we can have broader consensus. But then don't forget to focus on a community feedback meeting. A month later, or 2 weeks later, did you take the time to learn what went right, what went wrong, what could have been done differently? What did you not hear that others in the audience might have heard? So making sure that you complete the circle of feedback so that you're listening afterwards as well. In today, especially in this era of COVID and all the tools that we've needed to learn to be successful in the online world, email and social media and surveys are clearly critical components to making sure we get the word out, critical in making sure that we take the time to figure out, is the audience that we're trying to reach available on Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, or not at all? Maybe they're only available if you meet them at the recycling center, or if you meet them at the grocery store, wherever they're going to be. And we cannot overlook the fact that in-person meetings are often where most decision-making and most meaningful and deeper conversations typically occur in some sort of in-person meeting. So whether that's a focus group, an open house meeting, or charrette, those are critical components. And so often a community engagement plan needs both an online presence as well as an in-person presence. And so figure out within the time and resources you have available, how do you cover both as much as possible? I'm well aware that Plan New Hampshire and all the good work that you've been doing for decades has built a foundation on charrettes as a key tool to discussing design ideas, bringing in content experts from throughout the profession to make sure that there's vibrant dialogue on charrettes. They can be a powerful way to get a lot of ideas across in a short period of time. They can be a way to demonstrate that you're listening to ideas. I think there can be challenges with charrettes, and that sometimes the issues have lots of nuances and complexities that may be hard to grapple with in a 2 or 3 hour period, and bringing everybody together at one period sometimes has logistical challenges as well. So I spent about a decade doing this every week for week in and week out, doing charrettes as the norm. And I would say I learned a lot along the way, things that worked well, things that didn't. But I think the one area where I've spent more of our time as a firm, we've spent a lot more resources around what we call open house meetings. This notion that that if we bring together a series of discussion tables and we have conversations in one corner about walkability or trails or transportation or whatever the dynamic may be, and maybe in the other corner we have a conversation about the kinds of businesses or commerce or those kinds of conversations, and then maybe there's another corner of the room that talks about community character and architecture and the things that we want to preserve and protect. So these are different nuances. These all can be similar, but I think these open house meetings have a lot of merit, and that they can be both an in-person conversation as well as documents that can be shared with in an online forum as well. Some of these open house meetings are often kind of spread out throughout a public meeting space, where maybe there's a room dedicated to taking an online survey. Maybe there's a couple of computers there for doing a survey. There's maybe a welcome station where people can sort of learn more about what's happening. There are also areas where community character or streetscape or parking or transportation, there can be a bunch of different conversation areas within that open house focused around the key topics of that conversation. Here's an example from an open house meeting where the civic spaces, both post-it notes and dots and different images and different ideas can be discussed. And so I think these are all elements of an in-person meeting that often can be very successful if we engage people and show that we are actively listening, and it's not just going through the motions. It has meaning, and we need to be very transparent about what are the expected outcomes. Just because you're saying you're there to listen, we also need to be transparent about what are you going to do with that information. It's not enough to just say you're listening, but you need to be actively listening, and make sure you have newsprint pads there to write ideas, and make sure that you get the nuances of why somebody wants that to occur. And then we need to make sure that we're reporting back. Here's an example from a community open house of about 80 people where we committed to reporting back and saying, here's what percentage of people were concerned about traffic. Here's the people that were concerned about walkability and bikeability. And there was a great deal of support for creating a more village-like environment in this particular community. And we identified a number of different commercial uses that were desirable in this village crossroads. Online surveys are certainly not new. We've used lots of different kinds of surveys over the years. This particular tool is one that's done by MetroQuest, and I've worked with them 3 or 4 different times. They have some really impressive tools. They're probably on the high end of the cost scale, and so there's ways of doing these on more of a budget as well. And so I think there's merits depending on how complex the project is, how much you need to get across. These are both computers, sort of desktop friendly, as well as smartphone friendly, to make sure those ideas get across. One of the things you'll see on the map down here are that it's important to be able to use maps and icons and different ways of getting the ideas across, and making sure that you can understand where is there a problem with crosswalks, where is there a problem with pedestrian safety, where is there traffic congestion. Here's an example of a community survey. This is, once again, a MetroQuest example where ranking, pulling that yellow community character down and deciding where does that fit. Is that oftentimes all of these things may be important, but oftentimes we need to be clear, how do we get people to discern what's most important from what is tangential or kind of less important. Here's an example of kind of repeating kind of the rankings back, and in this particular community, sidewalks and walkability and neighborhood character were the kind of driving topics. Here's an example of the maps that can be used to sort of highlight different ideas for traffic and parking and green spaces and sidewalks. So a lot of different examples of how mapping can be used. And then here's examples of how those map icons get reported back, and we can begin to dig in to figure out where are the problem areas, what are the topics, and where do we need to focus our energies. This particular 4-image approach is typically called a visual preference survey or a community preference survey, and shows a number of different ideas for comparing which is the most preferred. Oftentimes, the issues in our communities can often come back to appropriate local character. And so making sure that we test images and ideas that can discern what's appropriate in that neighborhood, in that street, in that district. And hopefully we choose images that show enough differentiation that those concerns can be made. Here's an example of a preference survey for a village square, where we presented those 4 images, and 47% chose the image at the bottom left here, 16% chose the image at the upper right. But it's often not enough to know which one is preferred. We often need to know why. And so a typical follow-up question to sort of ask, well, why did you like that particular image? And in this case, people like the trees, the diagonal path, the fencing, the paving, the sort of felt like a sort of a college quadrangle to some people. And they're the images that were less preferred. And then some people said, 21% said existing park may be enough green space, maybe we don't need another one. So that was valuable input as well. Here's one other example of a different type of community preference survey, and that is one where we put boards of images up where we have more than 4, and we give people dots and different ways of putting sticky dots on different boards to say what they like, what they prefer, what's their first, second, and third preferences. We can also do the same thing with maps. We tend to call this dotmocracy to sort of reflect people's kind of voting with their stickers. And oftentimes those stickers are matched with notes about why they are concerned about that particular area. And this is another example where pedestrian problems or traffic problems can be revealed through dotmocracy. Just have maybe 2 more examples of exercises that can be useful. This one we've used in a number of different downtown settings where we've said, hey, if you had $100,000 or if you had $50,000 or $10,000, where would you want to spend that? And how would you want to prioritize? It's interesting, people can say yes to a lot of things until they have to choose between competing good ideas and then have to decide where to put the money. And so we have a template where we'll print up different funny money and get people to kind of weigh in on where do they want to spend their money. Another example of an exercise is what we call a blue sky exercise, where we ask people to sort of think, without boundaries about the community's strengths or weaknesses, or what would you like to see enhanced or preserved. And those become different sticky walls where we have people put up those ideas, and everybody can easily go around and see what ideas were working, which ones had resonance. And so they become a way for ideas and really making sure everybody has a voice to be heard. And then we go through and kind of document that in a series of memos and things like that that we can report back to the community at the next event. And then this exercise here is an interesting one. There's kind of a travel book called Lonely Planet. And so for those of you who enjoy travel, Lonely Planet will, have an example of a page about going to Barcelona or Rome or, New Orleans or wherever you might travel to. But imagine if your community had a page in that travel book and you had to tell somebody in 5 minutes what makes your community worth visiting. We found this to be very engaging, where people come up with photographs of the kinds of events that they find most meaningful, where they describe strengths, what are the things to see and eat and drink and do, what are you famous for, what does your typical citizen do? And so these become, some meaningful ideas that are really help capture what makes each community memorable and unique. That's the first section on engagement strategies and techniques. Tiffany or Cecilia, were there any questions that came in, or does anyone have questions they want to ask before we break into the next one?
There was one question from Barbara, who represents the New Hampshire Association of Conservation Commissions, and she asked, what is community character? This term is used a lot and it can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. And that kind of got me thinking and wondering so maybe what is community character? That's her question. But it kind of also got me thinking, when you go into a community and you're doing engagement and you're coming as an outsider, how is it that you're gauging what people mean? We go places and communities say, we want to preserve our rural character. That's pretty common, or historic character. But yeah, I think it is a good question. What does that mean, and how important is it to have like a specific definition? I don't know. I'll leave it at that. But what do you think, Mark?
Well, I think it really gets to the root of when we craft our standards for what's allowed in our communities. We're very clear about how many parking spaces you ought to have and how tall your building is allowed to be. But then we eventually get into different nuances where people are often very understandably concerned and fearful about change. And to the degree that we can have a meaningful conversation about architectural character, about street trees and streetscape character, to the degree that we can have a conversation about civic spaces and that we want places where we can gather and meet. If there are things that we want to and the community feels that they need to regulate, we need to have a process for having a meaningful conversation about what one person views as desirable community character, architecture, or sidewalks or landscaping. We often need to have a conversation about what is desirable and acceptable before we can start coding for it, before we can start putting something into a design guideline, which is advisory, or into a zoning ordinance, which is mandatory. We need to make sure that we're clear on what is the existing fabric of the community. And I'll show some examples later in some case studies where we've taken the time to measure sidewalks, measure buildings, measure an appropriate scale and character for a village hamlet may be different than a town, may be different than a city. And for us to talk about planning ideas that are supported, we need to make sure that we at least can have a dialogue about what is desirable and what is acceptable.
Thank you. Does anyone have any other questions right now related to what Mark has already been presenting? Okay, seeing none, hearing none. I think we can continue.
That's great. I'm now going to sort of dive into some examples of how community engagement is woven together with some case study examples of planning efforts. Once again, the community engagement process is connected with visioning and economic strategies. And so that is where I'm going to focus the energy right now. And here is a series of principles that are, I believe, worth holding on to. And that is, number one, at the outset of any community planning process, we need to work to be transparent about what are the goals. Make sure we set clear goals for what are we trying to accomplish, what's the desired outcome, and whom do we need to have at the table to have those conversations. If we're talking about safe routes to school, then maybe we're having a different group of people than if we're having a conversation about commercial vacancy. If we're having, so I think making sure that we create a community engagement plan is another key principle that's critical at the outset of a community planning effort. Who do we need to reach, and how can we engage them best? And so having a very clear engagement plan is critical. Compelling visuals. We've got to have compelling visuals. Many planning initiatives involve change. Change incites fear. Fear that it's going to be bad or worse than it is right now is often very real in many people's minds. And so we need to make sure that these images of what the transformation looks like are both realistic as well as compelling. And so I think that the visuals really need to tell a clear and powerful story about what we love about the place now, and what, if it were to change, how that same passion for whatever is unique in the character or scale or colors or sort of activity places that we are creating, we just need to make sure that it's consistent. So I think people they may not be able to put their finger on exactly why, but they'll look at it and say, I don't like it. It doesn't feel like my community. And so we need to work to make sure those visuals are really powerful and direct. And then the final one is community supported planning doesn't go anywhere unless there's good partners, unless there's partners who say, we're willing to help with implementation, we're willing to help with grants, we're willing to help with moving things forward. And so during that community planning process, making sure that you reached out to as many of the likely partners as possible is often a good effort to move forward with. Here's an example here where I'll dive into some examples here. This is a fishing village in Connecticut called Saugatuck that the community had some challenges figuring out what were their common ideas that they wanted to see happen. And so this particular community has a riverfront village and a train station. It has a historic swing bridge. And as you can see from the images on the bottom right, a number of 2- and 3-story 1800s buildings that wanted to be preserved and protected. And so the community engagement process here involved focus groups, involved the website, involved some surveys, and involved an open house and a number of different meetings with the steering committee to get there. The open house engaged about 130 individuals, and we had lots of different ideas and images and stickers and different ways of getting people engaged. We conducted a community character preference survey, And we were able to engage on the survey almost 1,400 people. But that came as a result of sharing emails with different audiences to make sure that we were connecting with. And we tried to survey and figure out, are we reaching the people we intended? Did we really hear from the right demographics that we were expecting to hear from? And part of what came out of that are a series of design standards about how tall buildings might be, what desired separations might be, what percentage of people preferred individual images, and understanding both what did they want it to look like, but what did they not want it to look like. And then there were a number of challenges of figuring out how to find common ground, because there were some divergent opinions about what the future of this village should look like. Part of what we did find common agreement on was the public realm and focusing on streetscape and sidewalk and civic spaces and lighting. And many of the roads in this village were the sidewalks were asphalt if they existed at all. There were very few curbs, and there were a lot of examples where the public realm was lacking and needed a lot of upgrades and a lot of attention. The private realm as to what to do, what to allow in terms of buildings and height and what to allow, there were a wide variety of opinions about what was acceptable and desirable. And so we spent a lot of time laying out these private realm improvement ideas in a series of code language that really tied back to dimensions and standards that were commonly understood. Ultimately, the community buy-in was on making sure that there was on a lot of walkable and safe streets. The character of existing buildings was protected. Here's an example of some of the existing streets with, as you can see, very little in the way of sidewalks. And ultimately, in this case, the immediate term buy-in was for near-term public improvements to sidewalks and streets and crosswalks. But ultimately, the long-term and future investment was to say that certain civic spaces and certain public places were to be invested in the long term in terms of economic development strategies. Here's a second example. This one's in Pennsylvania, in a community that is known for farmland preservation. They have preserved, a couple thousand acres of farms and natural areas in this particular community. And they were trying to figure out what to do with the shopping center and the commercial district that is at the center of this rural farmland area. And we went through a planning process. It was largely led by elected leaders, and they chose a sort of a hand-picked about maybe a dozen people to be a part of this community planning effort, but it was interesting. So we engaged with this dozen people on civic spaces and what kind of green spaces and what kind of local architectural character would they prefer. But unfortunately, these elected leaders sort of thought they knew the answers, thought they knew what the community would want. And in fact, they were misinformed. And when we really got around to actually, they kept saying, no, we really don't need to have those small group meetings. We really don't need to have those neighborhood meetings. Not necessary. I'm sure they're going to love it when they see it. The reality was that that community engagement effort needed to begin months and months earlier, before any of these ideas were revealed. And so this was an example of planning that occurred without adequate community engagement. And so I think there were a lot of lessons learned about making sure that we, even though from a smart growth planning perspective, this is, converting parking lots in a shopping center from what you saw in those images earlier, even though from a smart growth perspective, you could say, check the box. Yep, it had community green space. Yes, it had sidewalks. Yes, it had trails. Yes, it had those things, but the community at large didn't feel as if this was a planning process that prioritized them. And so we need to make sure that we, our engagement is ahead of the plans, not following the plans. Here's another community called Bridgeport. This is the Conestoga River here, the city of Lancaster, and is to the west here, and Lancaster County and its many farms are to the east. And so this is kind of this is the original King's Highway that went from Philadelphia to Lancaster. And so this is basically the farm to market route. Today, the Amish buggies go up and down these roads, and they're going across this bridge. And this is at the center of 4 municipalities. And so we couldn't turn to any one of these municipalities and say, well, what should we do here in Bridgeport? Because Lancaster Township and East Lampeter Township and the city of Lancaster and West Lampeter Township all had their own zoning, all had their own standards, all had their own ideas about what was right for this crossroads village. And so we engaged in a multi-year community engagement process, focusing on walkability, neighborhood character, transit choices, and improving traffic flow. We did what we talked about earlier, which is we had a series of small group meetings. We had, those small group meetings led to focus groups. The focus groups led to 2 community open houses. And because part of this occurred during COVID, one of those open houses was an online open house. So we really had to kind of overcome both in person and online to make sure we heard from all of the demographic groups that we knew we needed to hear from. As a part of this, we had a website, we had focus group meetings, we had a survey on community visioning, we had a survey on transportation choices, and we had a third survey on the final alternatives. And then we had a virtual meeting at the end of the meeting because we couldn't meet during COVID. So we ended up putting all of the boards for what people's survey, we put them up at like a township building and put them up in a public place, and people could come when they felt safe and could, fill out a survey, put it in the box, and could come and visit, in person, or they could do it online so that we could appeal to both. We had a wide variety of newsletters and websites and flyers and other things like that. And so here's an existing condition right now. This is Lincoln Highway, part of that old King's Highway back in 150, 200 years ago. And over time, what we recommended was a series of landscape medians and textured paving and bike lanes and sidewalks that didn't exist. And so this is an example of a community engagement process that engaged about over 800 people across 4 municipalities, across 3 school districts, 4 different independent zoning ordinances, all tying together to agree on a kind of walkable village center for Bridgeport. And so ultimately the recommendations came out focusing on streetscape enhancements and trails and traffic calming and some zoning standards, all of these things as a result of that community engagement initiative. And then I'm ready for the third and final part of the conversation. Any other comments before I move forward?
I
Okay.
didn't see any questions in the chat, but
That's great.
anyone?
I'll keep rolling and we'll
Okay.
wrap it up as questions. We have questions at the end.
There was some kudos for the interactive designs that you're showing, which I do think are very helpful.
Great. And then the third part I talked about was to make sure that these community visions are informing the design standards, that these community visions just don't end in a vacuum. They end with a series of design standards that can carry them forward and can give kind of meat on the bone to the recommendations. So we're here, engagement plus the vision plus the design standards to get to that vibrant place. So I think I'll focus on these design standards examples. number one key principle for this is to focus on the public realm. Far too many of our current zoning ordinances focus on what happens in the backyard. And so we need to, and I think there's been an evolution of thinking in terms of smart growth planning to really say, hey, let's focus on the streets, on the civic spaces, and active frontages, the storefronts, the porch, the front wall, the front windows. Let's focus on those things, and let's not worry as much about what happens at the parking lot in the backyard or let's focus on the frontage. And the second thing to focus in on, key principle, is adopting a regulating plan. If we can agree on where the front of the public realm exists, in this case here, this community, this village has a commercial street called Main Street that runs through here. Change my pen here. It has a Main Street runs through here, and this Mosier Avenue runs through here. We've also agreed that along this parkway, right now there's a whole bunch of parking lots that open onto a greenway. This is a waterway. This is a desirable public place. Let's make sure that this plan is not just about a typical zoning map, but focuses on where are the future streets, where should the pedestrian ways be, where is the front of the public realm. So these red lines and these black lines really define the edges of the public realm. And then the third and key final principle here is our zoning should really focus more on building forms and less on uses. You don't have to ignore uses, but imagine this building. It's probably from 1898. It's probably had 100 different uses over its history. And if we were micromanaging, whether it has, a medical office or a professional office or an apartment or I think there are times where we end up spending way too much energy focusing on the micromanaging of uses and less focus. And so I think, more focus on the form of, is a 3-story building in this location the right scale, the right look, the right feel? Is the building placed close to the street near the sidewalk rather than having a parking lot in front? Is the parking located in the rear? And so I think those things can often really make the community engagement conversations more meaningful if we're talking about things that really matter to the public. Here's an example of a community vision survey where we were looking at mixed-use buildings, where the examples of these kind of 2.5-story buildings and 3-story buildings with the tower were desirable. And here's an example of that survey. And we also did a survey of plazas and public spaces. So this particular community here has a series of auto-oriented commercial uses. The bottom right image here, you can see, the parking lot in front of the store, where this is a college town. There's 10,000, there's like 3,000 residents in this community, and there's maybe 7,000 college students here, and yet they don't have a place to go to. They have a college town without a walkable district. And so part of what this community asked for was, they said, would you help us to create a walkable district that would be for this crossroads area? So you can see the Victorian homes surrounding this area. There's the existing view, and there were half a dozen buildings that were compliant with the vision that this community wanted to see. Civic green space, some buildings that were 2 and 3 stories. Maybe at the very rear, they were got up to 4 stories, but in general, 2 and 3-story buildings. We identified where they would go. We identified where the civic spaces would go and where the public realm was. Ultimately, this is a community that now has a clear roadmap for how to create that walkable village environment. Here's another community where we did the visioning effort for this downtown district and created the form-based code. This is a borough of 4,000 people in Pennsylvania, where there are a number of residential and some commercial buildings that have, and so they said, hey, let's look at the 20 acres at the center of this crossroads community where you have 6 different roads coming together. And they said they wanted to create a new Main Street because this community is struggling economically. They do not have the level of tax ratables they need to support the vibrancy of this community, and they're at risk of becoming consumed by another adjoining municipality unless they can have an economic strategy and a place strategy for what they want to be and how they can get their taxes and their economic survival plan in gear. And so they've been working for a number of years now on transportation improvements and on creating this new Main Street, the parallel to this state road over here. And so part of this, this ordinance focuses in on this black area there. And so we conducted a survey where we reached 20% of the population of this community. And they said that this is the character of the buildings that they wanted to see in their community. It's the character of the gathering places. The survey results here came back with the sort of the character of the buildings that they wanted from the survey on the left, and on the right were 3D models that we prepared of what is the foundation for their zoning ordinance. And so we've identified where the buildings can be placed, where the parking can be placed, where the public civic space and plazas can be placed. We've identified the regulating plan for where the Main Street buildings and secondary streets and neighborhood streets, what that might look like. And then we've laid out, this is their historic kind of waterway called Sinking Spring that goes right through the middle of their downtown. And they've identified the 2- and 3-story buildings they'd like to see at the core. And they've identified that they want to have mixed use buildings on the upper floors. We've created some bonuses to be able to have upper floor residential over retail. And then another example of the storefronts and things there. So I know we're running short on time. So I guess, Tiffany, shall I finish this last example here, or shall I skip this one and maybe move to the wrap up?
Well, we do have a question, and I'm wondering if we can interject it, or if you'd want to. Okay. Well, Callie asked, how often do you have Department of Public Works, police departments, fire departments interact during the community engagement process? And I'm kind of wondering if she would be willing to say a little bit more about her question, not to put her on the spot, but it's okay if you don't want to, Callie, but I guess you have, oh, here we go.
I'm happy to address that. Go ahead.
Hi, Callie.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Yeah, I've been a participant of a few of these types of meetings in the past, and I guess the question is really, as it stands, I'm just curious to see how or when is a good time to involve the Public Works Department and the police and the fire departments to make sure that the community also gets that sort of feedback from the tax paying services that they're already paying into, and what their thoughts are, for instance, regarding the safeties during the medians for them to get to an emergency such as a fire or those sorts of things.
It's a great question, Kelly. It is especially if the project goals include changing roads or changing standards that affect roads, if it's something that's going to affect on-street parking, or something that's going to affect turn lanes or travel lanes, or any of the public safety issues that typically come up during a review with police and fire and public works and street design. It's important to have a conversation and have a stakeholder conversation early on in the process before you planning team has created any concrete recommendations, and then to have a follow-up before you get to the final implementation plan to say, hey, we heard this from the public, we're recommending these kinds of ideas. Are they consistent with best practices for public works? Are they consistent with, you know, fire safety concerns? Are they consistent with, you know, capital improvement programs? So I think, you know, hopefully there's a time and place to get the public works and public service providers involved at the beginning and, you know, before any recommendations are final.
Mark, would you usually do that where those types of individuals are in a group among themselves? If that makes sense, or can mixed with just any members of the community? Do you feel that it has mattered much, you know, to have like maybe the professional city management folks and safety department staff
It's tended
amongst
to
each
be,
other versus, yeah.
I mean, I would say for the initial meetings, I think you want them to be able to be as forthright and direct as possible at those initial meetings, so that if they have concerns, they can feel free to voice them clearly and loudly before you get too far along in the process. So I think as soon as it becomes a public meeting with a number of, you know, neighborhood groups or whatever, or citizen groups, you know, a part of the conversation, it's a different conversation when it's a multiple organizations and neighbors in the same conversation. So I would say usually it's better to have sort of the representatives of the public entities, you know, at an initial meeting. Anything else? I want to honor everybody's time, so I think I have one more example of a project here, and then I'll have a concluding comments and we'll wrap it up. This particular village, we worked hard to you know, do a lot of engagement where, you know, early on there were a number of 5 small group discussions about the downtown and transportation and parking in the public realm. And, you know, some of those initial kind of workshop meetings involved both open-ended conversation, 30 minutes of open-ended conversation, as well as kind of 15 minutes on, you know, sort of new ideas and so I think, you know, dialogue and discussion. Roundtable collaborative exercises happened at another event, you know, where there were 4 different discussion topics as the plan was starting to evolve a little bit more related to revitalization and redevelopment and parking. And as you can see here, we were, you know, very transparent about how the redevelopment of some existing parking lots might occur, and there were a lot of comments that we captured as a part of that planning process there. And then this led to kind of some maps in that regulating plan I showed you earlier, as well as some sketches and designs of just ways in which the building height in this valley was going to be respected and identified as an important design criteria. We've talked about the importance of the public realm. We've talked about the importance of identifying where storefronts might occur, where civic spaces might occur. And then some kind of overarching themes that affect many of the villages and communities where we're working is that the housing crisis that our nation is under right now does not have any easy or quick fix, and that many of these community conversations often need to include how can we, you know, focus on an accessory dwelling above a garage, or a cottage courtyard, or a carriage house, or a manor house where we may in fact have 3 different residences in a building that looks like a single family home. Or, you know, there's different examples of you know, small infill and accessory dwellings that can often be a part of any kind of thoughtful plan. Here's an example of a cottage court we worked on where the examples of public space and kind of different smaller and more kind of rural setting examples can be appropriate, and as well as different home types, manor houses. These are 3 different examples where these are 3 different condominiums, one on top of another, that are can fit within the context of a single family neighborhood. So to sort of wrap it up, I'd like to just sort of highlight that when it comes to engagement strategies, we need to focus on who to engage and how to best engage them, and use the best techniques that we have available to engage our communities. We need to make sure that that community-supported planning follows some good principles of transparency and a good community engagement plan. We need to make sure that the visuals are really compelling and that we engage our community partners. And lastly, we need to make sure that when we set those design standards, that we spend our time focusing on the public realm and the benefits that these plans bring. We need to have a sort of clear focus on where the public realm should occur, making sure that we focus on buildings that are in scale with our communities. I know that New Hampshire has a wide range of hamlets and villages and a couple cities, and so it's important that we make sure that all of the design standards and the community conversations are appropriate for the context of your community. So I'm honored to be a part of this conversation, and I'm happy to answer questions. And I hope that I've shared a few ideas that are meaningful and useful. I did want to share, and I know that Tiffany, she hasn't already shared it, will be sharing some of these. There are a number of different tools that we've been using over the years. My Sidewalk, MetroQuest, Social Pinpoint, SurveyMonkey, and Survey Legend as examples of tools that you all may want to consider using. These range in their price point and raise in their range of how they can be used, but we found each of them to be particularly useful. And I'm honored to be here with you all, and hope you found this useful.
Thank you, Mark. That was wonderful. I loved all the visuals, especially. Someone else said that in the chat too, but it really, I don't know, it really broadens like the mind around what can be done with engagement and with our communities. So are there any burning questions out there? And if not, I'm going to ask if Derek Lick from our board might have a couple words to say just about New Hampshire Gives. Nothing huge. Heather's already throwing some stuff in the chat and we don't want to belabor it, but do you mind, Derek?
Sure, I'll jump in. I've been asked to speak to everyone and ask them and remind them that New Hampshire Gives is happening right now. For those of you that don't know, this is an annual event put on by our nonprofit association in the state, and we've seen a link in our chat to go to the page between 5 p.m. today, so it started now, through 5 p.m. tomorrow. Donations through the New Hampshire Gives website have the opportunity to be matched by funds from the Charitable Foundation and other entities. So to the extent you are inclined, no donation is too small and no donation is too big either to Plan New Hampshire. So feel free to do that. And thank you for participating today. And thank you, Mark, for the presentation. We greatly appreciate it.
You're welcome, Derek.
Thank you. I love that no donation is too big. That's all. That's great. This was recorded. So again, I will be sharing it out with a follow-up email probably tomorrow, and eventually it will be on our website as well. So if you want to share it with colleagues or anything of that nature, it will be available because there were so many great ideas in there. So thank you again to our speaker, Mark Evans, and a round of virtual applause and virtual applause emojis. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all. Take care.